John-Mark Dyer, welcome to TheologyU. We talk about big theological ideas, but we're having intentionally accessible conversations with some really impressive people. Recorded here at Harvard Divinity School. Normally, I do an introduction for you, but in your case, I want to have you introduce yourself, mostly because you're semi-famous, at least on Instagram. Most guests that I'm going to have on this podcast are academics, but I'm super thrilled to have you and your expertise because I think it's going to fill a pretty good hole, which we see in academia. I see you as having this expertise in communication, using social media, and sharing the gospel, which is just so important. So tell us who you are, where you're coming from, and what you do on a daily basis. And thanks again for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. That was quite an introduction. Um, so my name's John Mark, and I grew up in Chicago. But for the last 12 years, I have lived in Hawaii on the Big Island because there is a large campus devoted to missions, and the organization is called Youth with a Mission, and we everybody calls it YWAM for short. And it started back in the '60s. Uh, and at that time, if you wanted to be a missionary, like you had to jump through all the hoops. You kind of had to be sent out by your denomination. You had to go to seminary, and it was interesting. God was actually speaking to a number of people at that time about how the Great Commission. There was all these barriers in front of it, and so this guy named Lauren Cunningham, he felt God speak to him about the importance of young people going into missions and removing these barriers and giving people permission. And so he went to his denomination and said, well, I'd like to send short-term teams of young people. And they said, no, that's not how we do it. And he said, okay, I'm going to start a thing called, I don't know what he called it at first, but eventually it became YWAM. And so it's grown. It's all over the world. I think there's YWAMers literally in every country. Lauren used to always say, I can get you into any country. I just can't promise to get you out, which I always really liked. And so I studied biology at the University of Illinois and worked for 3 years at a really incredible nonprofit. But I just felt like God wanted to do something more or different in my life. And the story is actually really dramatic. We could get into it, but how God spoke to me. But ended up following my sister out to Hawaii and did this thing called a YWAM Discipleship Training School. And it totally flipped my life upside down. It was everything that I was really searching for. I came here and I saw these people telling stories about the revivals that had happened through history and kind of had faith, like we need to see this again in our generation. Like, look at the state that we're in. Like, we desperately need another Jesus movement. And my heart just like burned. And I thought, okay, I found my people. And so I just, started running these schools. I was a student and I helped run them. And it took me all over the world. And so I've gotten to share Jesus in, tons of different cultures and countries, and just gave me this fascination with how Jesus is good news to people. And now it's 12 years later, and I decided finally I should share some of this stuff on social media because I guess I looked at I was scrolling on TikTok and I was watching the gurus and the manifestors and all these people sharing their worldviews with real confidence and boldness, and I thought, well, who's showing up talking about Jesus? And mostly what I saw was, wait, don't scroll. And, God's got a message for you. And I just thought, I'm glad that they're there, but I think I just wanted to say something a little bit different. And so, yeah, for the last 9 months, I've been kind of creating content around what I find the interesting discussions in Christianity, and mainly geared toward how do you do something with your faith? Like, it's not supposed to be about information. It's supposed to be about really loving people and seeing Jesus transform their life. And I think that's kind of at least what a lot of American Christianity really needs. So there's my long-winded introduction.
Yeah, no, it's great. I have many questions based on your introduction. Lots of places we could go. Um, I think first, I'd love to hear your dramatic story. I don't know how interested you are in telling the whole thing,
Oh
but
no,
I think it'd be
this is
helpful
wild.
to hear it. Yeah, let's
This
hear
is
it.
really wild. So I made a 3-year commitment to work at this organization, and looking back, I was like, it was just the Lord. I could see His hand on it. There were so many things I learned and needed in that season, and
And so this is while you're working.
yes,
You're making
these are
this
my
decision.
three work years, and
Okay.
so it was a nonprofit, and they sent me to Zambia for 3 months, and it was a really incredible experience. But I actually came back quite jaded because I don't know. As a college student, you're just like, oh, it's so easy to change the world. You raise some money, you get people excited, you send it, and man, their lives are forever changed.
Right.
And I got over to Zambia, and we did shoe drives, and and then all of a sudden, you hear, oh yeah, they send over the shoes, and then the next day, everyone's selling them in the market because they need the money more than the shoes. And I was just like, oh wow. And then the guy who runs the local charity, clearly he's siphoning off funds because his house is just way more incredible than anybody else in his community. And where's he getting this money? And so I came back, with kind of two pictures. I saw this incredible need, and got really face to face with people that live on less than $1 a day, and saw their faith, saw their lifestyle, and but then just saw that, oh, changing the world, changing people's lives, not as simple as I wanted it to be. And I was there alone, so I was quite lonely, and I just kind of was like, nah, I'm gonna work in New York. I'm gonna send money, but I want a comfortable life. And it kind of, at that point, it was, if you would have looked at my story and how I traveled around the world after high school, and my grandfather and dad's story and how they worked in missions and in the nations, you would see that was a big departure from kind of my core DNA. And but I kind of made this inner vow out of pain, like I'm never going to another nation. Give me America. And so I come back from that, and I'm like, I wasn't so interested at working at this organization anymore. And so I would just start to pray, like, God, like, what's next? And he was silent for 3 years, because I think I made that commitment, and he knew I needed actually what they were teaching me. But right at around the end of the third year, my sister starts saying, John Mark, I hear you complaining all the time. I know you want to move on. Why don't you come and do YWAM? And I thought, nah, like, I don't fit there. Nations, like, not the right fit for me. And just, she kept saying it. And then I feel like God speaks to me through a couple of dreams.
Mm.
So go to sleep one night, and I see the office building I work at, and a guy is walking out of the front door, and he's got a sweatshirt, and it's got my name on it. And I wake up, and I just have this sense, like, whoa, maybe God is giving me permission to leave. Like, it's time. And then I get a dream that a guy in our office gets fired. And then I get a dream that our office gets sued, that there's this lawsuit that comes against him. And I go to my grandpa, and I'm like, what do I do with these? Like, should I tell somebody? And he's like, no, why don't you just hang on to them, put them in your back pocket, And so my sister says, come on, John Mark, I know you want to go to YWAM. And so I'm wrestling with that. And then the guy gets fired. And so then I'm kind of like, whoa, what's going on? Like, maybe these dreams are like timing or something. And another month goes by, and my sister nags me one last time, and all of a sudden in the car ride, I can't explain it, but just I know it's what I'm going to do. I have this incredible peace that comes in my
Mm.
heart. And I go home. It was Friday. I went home, filled out an application. Um, and then Monday comes, and I know I'm like, I'm out. I'm going to talk to my boss, tell him I'm going to quit. And it's the first job I had. So I was quite nervous. And he comes in, starts going through the mail. And it's, an open office, cubicles. And so I can hear him talking to my coworker. Opens the letter and he goes, "Oh my gosh, look at this. We're getting sued." And I'm in the cube, my hands go up. I'm like, that's crazy. Like, I don't know why God chose two very negative signs to kind of confirm the decision. But from that point on, it was like, I just knew. I was like, okay, that decision that I made to quit and go to YWAM, like that timing was crazy. Uh, I've never had dreams like that of something that actually happened in the future. But I think because it was going to be such a dramatic life shift, it was moving, uh, changing jobs, moving to another state, um, that God needed to really underline it. And so, yeah, I went, did the school, and then my sister, of course, she was right. I loved it, changed my life, and then I was like, I got to join staff, and I've been working with them ever since. So that was the
Yeah,
story.
that's a great story. That it's a real testament to the power of prayer. I think, ironically, 3 years of silence reminds me of Tim Keller's book called Prayer, where he talks
Huh.
about this process of developing a prayer life. And he says something very similar. I don't think it was 3 years, I think it was for a year. And he says, when he really committed to consistently making prayer a part of his life, he didn't hear a thing from God for, I think it's a year.
Oh wow.
And when I read that a few months ago, it really struck me that, like, here's a guy telling you to just start praying, just get into it. And he didn't hear anything for a year. And he's saying, don't expect to hear anything for a year. Keep going, keep going, keep going. And to me, it's a testament of your story. That's what I'm hearing in that is,
Yeah.
wow, like that's a lot of, that's a lot of faithfulness to keep at it. That's cool.
Yeah.
I don't,
Hearing God's voice was my biggest frustration. I remember coming into YWAM and that being like, I just didn't get it. Like, I mean, the dreams, but like if I had to specifically, ask God for something in detail, I didn't understand when people said I heard God's voice. And I think what's been so interesting as I've grown in depth of friendship with Jesus, as I know his character, his voice has become so familiar to me now. And it was in that process of becoming like a true friend. You had to build friendship and depth with him before you could kind of hear his voice. And so I think that's one of my favorite parts of prayer is when you develop. It's not just, I don't know, my whole paradigm of prayer used to be like, I'm just praying for things that I want. And it was me shooting things up. And I guess, somehow God was pulling the strings and making things happen. But it's turned into a much different, richer kind of back and forth now. Um, and I attribute it to, growing in depth of friendship with him.
how do you know when it's him now that you have a more, you could say, direct line? How do you know that it's him and not your
Well,
emotions or something else?
yeah, I've only been able to find out through risk. I'll give you a story that happened last Friday. So we were doing a kind of a generosity day, and kind of our whole campus got together, and we had this like staff retreat, and so we wanted to ask the Lord, is there something that I can give to somebody else on staff that would bless them, and let's just practice the spirit of generosity. And I kind of missed that memo. And so that, people in my house were talking about it that morning, and I was like, oh shoot. And, I was like, I'm eating my eggs. I don't have time to really pray. So I just closed my eyes real quick. I'm like, God, is there anything like that's kind of precious to me that would mean something to somebody else? And, I thought about this rug in my room this beautiful, like Persian rug that I'd gotten, and that came to mind. And at that point, like I would say if you're like, how confident were you that you heard God? I would have said, 15%. It felt like a whisper. It was that still small voice. And And I was like, okay. And so I rolled it up, and I remember feeling like pretty embarrassed actually to bring it. I was like, this is so dumb. And I walk in, I walk into the room where we're gathering, and even thinking like in my mind, like, I don't know, I might just like end up walking home with this. And I said, God, like, how am I going to figure out who to give this to? And again, he goes, look for somebody in a red hat. And I was like, that's another 15% confidence. And so I kind of scanned the room, and I saw, at the time I only saw one red hat, but there were three in the end. And I was like, you know what? And I kind of wrestled. I was like, I don't want to go up to this guy. This is so weird. What do I say? Do I just give him a rug? That's so dumb. He's like, a 20-year-old kid. He doesn't want a rug. But I just, I felt like, I was like, God, what do I say? And he was like, where's the rug from? It's from the Middle East. And I was like, oh, okay. And so I just, this is me even being sheepish. I went up to him. I'm like, hey, are you interested in the Middle East? And then I explained the story. Like, I heard about the rug, and then I looked for a red hat, and tears in his eyes, like welling up in his eyes. He's like, you have no idea what this means. Like, God has been speaking to me about moving to the Middle East. Like, this is a confirmation. So I went and got the rug, gave it to him, prayed for him. He came up to me later, like his eyes red at this point, because he's like, this was so powerful. Like, thank you for obeying. And that has been the story of my whole, like, hearing God's voice. I always feel under 50% confident, and what's funny is usually when I feel like, oh man, this is God, and then I share it with people and I am more confident, they're like, I don't know. I'm not sure about that one. And so it's really just been a process of, I hear and I try, I obey. And through that process of taking risks, it's the only way I've known and been able to discern, that I think, this probably is the Lord. And I don't know, maybe my skill set, I've just learned when I get it wrong, how to graciously bow out and kind of be like,
Yeah,
oh, okay, that's fine. That was me. That wasn't God. So that's been the process.
yeah, I think that's really convicting because, especially in the US, I think so many people get frustrated that they're not hearing from God, myself included, because it's not that 100% certainty. And in our world of wanting things to be sure and wanting, knowledge, um, it's so often that people feel like they never hear from God. And this is
Yeah.
reminding me randomly of even times when I used to work in the city in Chicago, and there were a couple times in a year and a half when I would see a homeless person. There's homeless people everywhere,
Mm.
and a couple times it was really put on my heart to, like, throw them a couple bucks or sit down and talk to them, and I never did. And there were a couple days that I would get on the train home, and just it would eat me up. And I thought, you know what? I wasn't sure. I thought maybe God, maybe the Holy Spirit was prompting me, but I wasn't sure. And then my
Yeah.
fear would say, don't do it.
Yeah.
And it would really eat me up after. And I think that eating on my conscience was somewhat indicative that maybe that was, maybe something would have come of that.
Yeah.
Um,
100%. The best way to get over that is you have to find that one friend that kind of wants to go on that adventure with you, and you guys provoke each other to take risks. That's the only way that I've been really successful, because that fear of man thing, it it you always get that. Like, I've
mm,
been doing this now for 12 years, and I still feel that doubt and kind of like, I don't know. But when I bring a friend or have some sort of, because it'll come in seasons. Like, there'll be seasons of, like, man, I used to, like, you know have my ears open to the Lord, and I would notice, at a store, like, go up, talk to that person. And so I'll go in seasons where, like, oh, I'd totally forgotten, like, that used to be a value. I want to carry that again. And so I'll go up to my buddy Zane and be like, man, we should go after this again. And then, it's the group text. It's like you and your friends. And I promise, like, that is the game changer. Or when I was at University of Illinois, me and my buddy Nathan were kind of like the two, because, I grew up Illinois megachurch, Willow Creek. Christianity was like about leadership principles and good Bible teaching. It wasn't this kind of, it didn't have any of those, like, charismatic elements of, like, hearing God's voice or praying for healing. And so my mom was the one. We all thought she was crazy, but she was kind of the one that opened that world up to us a little bit. And I found one friend at U of I, and we would go to the quad and we would just like try to pray for people uh, try to hear like a prophetic encouragement for people, and it makes all the difference to get that one friend to do it with you.
Yeah, I guess there's so many things I want to touch on, including your socials, which I guess we'll have to wait because this is too pressing. My because on that charismatic note, I think the reaction, and I see it at Harvard, I see it all over the place, to megachurch culture is I think you have two responses to someone who's been frustrated with that, who it's not working for. It's either to go the charismatic route and look for the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, or it's to go more towards the main line and say, we're going to not focus on evangelism. We're going to focus on, social gospel and living it out. And we're just going to take a break and kind of rebuild, pull the weeds out of the soil and kind of rebuild. And obviously, you're more on the charismatic end. And I'd love to hear you flesh out a little bit more, like where you get your confidence that that's the right way to approach it, or was that just put on your heart and you had no choice? Like, I'm curious how you got there, as that's your strategy of choice.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say it's the right answer. I would say
Mm.
it's one answer, but I have a pretty holistic view of what uh, a Christian is, how they're supposed to function in society, and I would say I see just as much value in a Christian running their business ethically, or somebody trying to reach out, build a feeding program for the homeless, as I do the more charismatic Christian that goes up to people and says, hey, I feel like God's got something to say to you, can I talk to you for 5 minutes? um, but I guess on my own personal journey, grew up at Willow Creek, and my mom was the one that started hearing these speakers from more charismatic streams, and we honestly all thought she had like lost her marbles and she was crazy and open to deception and all that kind of stuff. And I was kind of a holdout. Part of me really wanted it to be true. I remember kind of testing out a book and reading it and being like, just like desperately, I was like, this would be so cool if this were actually true. But I don't know. I guess I was so afraid of being deceived or
Mm.
something, or looking a fool. But I started listening to the music that came out of some of those churches, and I just like I would break down weeping. I
Mm.
remember in college, like sitting at my desk listening to these songs and just like crying, car rides and things like that. And so at that point, I was like, "There's got to be something, in this. This can't be all deception. Like God is really meeting me in my heart." And so I went through a couple different um, churches and voices that I was that kind of called out to me, and were quite interesting. And then when I finally landed in YWAM, I feel like YWAM was an interesting mix because it definitely has those charismatic roots, but really the emphasis is on we're interdenominational, and we just need to be people that take action and do something with the gospel and the Great Commission, um, and so these are all just tools that we're going to use. And so that was kind of how my journey progressed. And I look back on some of the things that I believed or got swept up in the beginning. I was like, okay, there's definitely, I look back and say there was immaturity there. And you look at the charismatic movement and you think, gosh, they could use a little bit more intellectualism. But then you look on the other side and you're like, yeah, they could use a little bit more freedom and joy in their worship. So
Yeah.
I feel like I've grown in real appreciation for people in all sorts of different streams at this point.
Yeah. 100%. That's really, I think you're hitting it, the nail on right on the head with. taking action. I mean, no matter where you're falling, let's have a faith that does something. Um, and I love your rug story. I want to go back to that.
Yeah.
Um, and just having that experience of taking the risk and then having the immediate assurance that that impulse was the Holy Spirit, which then becomes an encouragement to act on the next one, right? And
Yeah.
it's that little bit of fuel that you need, is such an encouragement in a world where so many people never do stuff like that. And I think the fear is, I was just reading, I've been reading about the early evangelical revivals in the 17, 1800s. And
Yeah.
George Whitefield is a big preacher. He had a series of miscarriages and then had a son. And he's preaching several times a day. And he has the son, and he thought that God told him that his son would be a great preacher, would be the next big thing. And he started proclaiming this in his sermons, that this is what God had told him. And then his son passed away at 4 months old.
Whoa.
And Whitfield he had to make this big apology. And he said, that wasn't God. That wasn't what God was telling me to do. And so, I like your confidence rating for, like, how sure was Whitfield that his son was going to be a pastor? And then that wasn't God's plan. And you
Yeah.
think, well, you want to avoid that. But in this case, you also want to act on the impulses. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering, for someone who's trepidatious, how do you advance with confidence when you think you might have that nudge? And how do you know when not to?
No, you just advance scared. That's that's
Mm-hmm.
the key. There's so many stories I have going up to people and or sharing things and it'd be like, oh man, I got that wrong. Um, I remember going up to somebody at the grocery store, sitting there. I was like, hey, do you have any back pain that I could, I don't even think I said pray for because I was just too nervous that he would say no. And he's like, no, back feels great. And I was like, okay, talk to you later. Just walked away. There's so many things like that. Um, but I guess, that's kind of the game is you have to be willing to take those risks if you want some of the incredible stories too. Because yeah, I've had other times where I've gone up to people and I think one time I gave, it was another generosity sort of day and I was like, okay, I should give this guy my iPhone. And I think I went up, gave him my iPhone, and he's like, oh wow, thank you for this. Like, I already have one, but thanks for a second. And I was like, no, because I was like, that was such a miss. But then I've had other like incredible stories where I mean this one was so powerful. Uh, okay, these are all generosity stories, but there was a I guess there's a lot of that in YWAM. But we were doing this was among just our young staff and felt like God said, "Would you give somebody your car?" And I was, at that point you're like, "No, this is too real deal." I I I don't want to give that away. And so I'm really wrestling with God and kind of saying, are you sure? Like, but I want to be surrendered if you're really saying this. And and then this was interesting because I looked around and I was like, how would I know who to give it to? And then as soon as I saw the person that I felt like I was supposed to give it to, I guess kind of that same feeling of peace and assurance that I had when my sister told me to do YWAM and I finally decided.
Mm.
I saw him and I was like, oh, this makes sense. Like, okay. And then I went up to him and same sort of thing, instant tears. And he was like, you have no idea. Like, my parents, was a local guy from the island. He's like, my parents literally have been praying for a month for a car. Our family doesn't have one. Um, and even this morning, my dad, like, God rebuked him and said, don't you have faith that I could give you a car for free? And so that was, it's like, so you get one of those stories and then you get five or six, misses, but the one is so incredible where you're just like, holy cow, I got to be the answer because I listened and obeyed. I got to be the answer of this guy's incredible story of faith that's written into his life that you're like, okay, I want more of those. So, I'll take the risk. I'll take the embarrassing moments. Because it just becomes worth it.
Yeah, totally. I love that. And even the misses, like even the phone story, you never know what God is going to do with that. And you don't need me to tell you this, but
Yeah.
whether it's somebody hears you tell that story here and
Yeah.
goes, wow, that guy was willing to give up his phone, or that guy tells his friend, some guy gave me his phone.
Yeah.
And then, you never know where those ripples go. Like it's never a zero sum,
Yeah. Well, that
but
was the thing that finally gave me confidence. We I shared a prophetic encouragement with somebody, and they're like, "No, that totally doesn't fit." But then 3 months, and so I walked away from that. It was kind of early on when I was learning to hear God's voice, and I walked away. I was like, "See, I don't hear God. I'm terrible at this." And he came up to me a couple months later, and he goes, "Hey, I didn't see it at the time, but what you said was absolutely correct. I was just kind of blind to it." And as soon as he shared that, something clicked in me, like, whoa, I really do hear God, and I need, like, I have to be obedient to God no matter what the response is, because he might be working through me even though I can't see it with my eyes. And so from that point on, I kind of decided, okay, I'm, even though I don't feel confident, or they might kind of say, no, I don't think so, I have to be obedient, um, to speak. Which I guess if you look at, Jeremiah, the prophets in the Bible, that's that was exactly the name of the game, is like, you share what God says, and then who knows how they're going to respond.
there's so much there. That's so good. Because he may be working on you too. It might not even be about the other
Oh,
person. It could equally be
100%.
about you, and sometimes
100%.
even more so. That's how I feel. Oftentimes, trying to do ministry with high schoolers, for example, is oftentimes I feel like I'm growing more spiritually than them by the questions that they're raising, or you can extend that to any sphere of ministry or pretty much anything you're doing with God, because ultimately he's the one doing the work. The Spirit
Yeah.
is the one doing the work. And oftentimes I feel when we get to be a vehicle, you get to enjoy getting a front row seat to what God is doing for the other person. And oftentimes that serves you in your
Yeah.
spiritual walk, even more so than it could for someone else, even on the off chance that you do bring them to tears, or the Spirit brings them to tears
Yeah.
because of something God's already been doing way before you, and something God would have done with or without you.
Yeah.
But your obedience allows you that front row seat, which is the gift. I mean, that
Yeah.
is the ultimate prize for your obedience is, wow, I got to watch God do something right in front of my face, and I know this person. And
Yeah.
that is the most beautiful thing. I love your charge to be bold and about saying what God wants you to say, regardless of the outcome, is so, so powerful.
Yeah. It's revealing too, I mean, I have plenty of stories where God told me to do something and I chickened out, and it really is a test. It's kind of like, oh, that fear of man that I thought I was over, still alive and well. Like, I really, I need to keep, you know, uh, surrendering and laying down my rights to the Lord. So it is quite revealing.
Yeah, it's so good. I want to get back to talking about revivals. You said earlier that
Yeah.
um, looking for revival, and I'm curious what your insights are on that, how you approach it, what you're looking for, what if you had to predict what God's going to do, and kind of just your attitude towards that kind of hoping for something big,
Yeah.
but also acknowledging that it's God doing the work. I just wonder, in a ministry context, how do you frame that in your head?
Yeah, that has been a really interesting journey, because when I first started reading about revivals, I mean, it was, talk about a paradigm shift. I had no idea. Um, you know, I'd never heard about Azusa Street or the Welsh revival, the Clapton sect. All these moves of God where it changed a generation, it impacted nations, and so I just heard that, and my view of what was possible totally shifted. But then I also became really convinced it was gonna happen right now. And I got really disillusioned when it took longer than I thought, or um, and and it's interesting because, some of the powerful things that God has spoken to us as a movement, like I look at kind of what has happened over the last 10 years, and I'm like, I don't know. Like, I don't know how to qualify something. I'm not an expert to say, yes, that's a revival, that's not. But, to see how God spoke to us about a circuit rider movement uh, being rebirthed, like um, Francis Asbury and what was his name? John Wesley. They had a whole circuit rider movement, and God saying, I want to do that again, a modern day circuit riders, which would crisscross the nation. And now seeing, there's a YWAM group called the Circuit Riders. They just took took the name and the DNA, and they're like, we're going to do it. And now they're reaching, tens of thousands of college students. They're at hundreds and hundreds of universities. And I'm like, wow, God really, he took a group of 300. Well, he took a group of like 30 people, and then he brought together the first school 300, and now there's tens of thousands of people that have been affected by that. And I just was like, okay, it didn't look like I thought, and it took 10 years to build, but that was powerful. And that's incredible that it just came up out of nothing. And then I think about what God spoke about filling stadiums. And at the time we were a small YWAM thing, and we'd never gathered more than like 500 people. And then this big storyline happens, and I don't know if you've ever heard of these events called the Send, but it's been a like kind of a Great Commission stadium gatherings, and now there's like 9 or 10 of them happening all around the world in the next 2 years. And you look at that and you're like, wow, like God really did say something. And so I guess I got a little bit cynical for a little while, because I was like, man, all the big things that we dreamed of, did they really happen? And now I'm looking back and saying, whoa, like maybe we didn't have Welsh revival yet, but look at like the groundwork that God is building, and he's given the Send movement and the circuit rider movement. And um, so yeah, now I'm kind of in a posture of like, wow, I really want to hear what God has to say about our generation. And I'm looking at the just weekend Christianity and the Wednesday night Bible story. It's not really working for our generation. I think it's still the answer. The local church is still the answer, but something is not connecting with Gen Z, and we're not pulling them in like we need to be. And I think God does have an answer for that.
Yeah, this it's timely for me again because the early evangelical stuff, and you brought up John Wesley, has been really formative for me over the last couple of months. Um, Thinking about what they emphasized, which was this was post Enlightenment. You can have an experience with God individually. You can be filled with the Holy Spirit, and
Mm,
that these are core tenets of our faith that now evangelicalism has come to represent something different. But the early tenets of that revival really are what spurred Christianity all around the world for the last couple
yeah,
hundred years. And in some ways, most of what we see is somewhat of a continuation of that and kind of reclaiming what what God originally did with them in the early 1700s in Europe and here. And also, I think it's easy to get, at least for me, in this mindset of America, when God is doing revival work, like you said, with the Send and other things. Christianity is exploding in Africa, the Middle
yeah,
East, other places other than America. And I think that's been a helpful reminder for me in my moments of cynicism, as I think the same thing. I think about what is church going to be for people my age, and it's easy to get cynical. I think, especially when you're in an urban area in America,
yeah,
and to think just to zoom out and think God is so much bigger than that. It's helpful for me at least because you have a more global picture, just being with YWAM and whatnot. That God is on the move
oh
somewhere,
yeah,
and He's such a big God. I mean, He's always doing something.
yeah. I think I have this right, that the biggest church in London right now is led by an African missionary. and that the
Hmm.
fastest growing church in the world is in Iran, is what I've heard. So
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
it's it's pretty it's interesting when you, because we, especially in America, it's, we have such a I don't know, corporate view of Christianity, and it's all about your social media, and it's about your branding and things like that. And well, I don't know. I guess that's a cynical look at it too, because you meet any of the pastors, and you're like, oh man, I love your heart. You're actually like
No.
the real deal, and you're just trying to use these tools. But I guess there's an outward facing view of what Christianity is that looks a bit commercial, um, but then you see how the church is growing in these nations, and yeah, it's quite a contrast.
Yeah, and you're right. The local church was the answer, is the answer, will always be the answer. But there's so much else that goes into it as well. I want to move to your socials because I do want to
Yeah,
talk about what you've done with social media. And I didn't realize it had only been 9 months. I
yeah.
assumed you'd been at it a lot longer than that. So tell me about how you started that. Again, maybe a little more detail on how you felt called into it,
Yeah.
how you got over the initial inevitable first 20 posts that probably don't get a lot of likes and feels
Yeah.
embarrassing. Just walk me through that, the early stages of that, and yeah, we'll go from there.
Yeah. So one of the things that I do here at YWAM is teach young people about the power of media as a tool, and how important it is to be a voice that shows up and makes good arguments for Christianity and for Jesus, because that's where the young people are. If you want to reach Gen Z, Gen Alpha, that's the platform. And I guess I felt like I was doing it in my own way. Like I remember when was it Cardi B that made the WAP song?
I think so.
When that came out, like, I was in the prayer room, and I heard about the song, and I was praying about it, and I felt like God spoke to me. So I made kind of a carousel post, and posted it, and it got a ton of reshares, and it was the first time kind of something of mine took off a little bit. And
You talking about Cardi B was not on my bingo card for how God worked in your life, but I'm so glad that it is. So keep going.
and I don't know when that song came out anymore, but it seems like a couple years later, I'm still thinking like, man, in teaching people, we got to get out on social media. And I just realized, I looked at the game that I was playing with carousel posts, and I was posting a lot of my story, I guess, and I was like, you got to play the game that everyone else is playing. And I thought, okay, I have to start making reels. Like there is a game that influencers are playing, and I have to sign up if I really care about this, and if the need is as real and big as I'm telling people it is, then it's time to go in. And I was with the circuit rider guys actually in California, and some of them had kind of done it before me, and I was at their house at dinner and talking to them about it. And my friend Chloe broke it down and was kind of like, "You could totally do it. I spend this many hours working on it, and I do 3 a week." And I just walked away from that with courage. I was like, "Okay, that's it. I'm in." And so I just committed. I was going to do 5 posts a week, and I was just going to stick with it. And you're totally right. The first, I think, 3 months was, I was just, you can scroll back, you can see, I was like, I didn't know what to do. I had some ideas. Um, but then my favorite guy on TikTok, PDUSA, he's a musician, but he does these really quirky, funny, witty, like skits with himself. Um, and I aspire still to be like Petey, uh, because his they're so funny, and the production is better than just sitting in front of a screen and talking to yourself. um, but I was like, you know what? I should try one of those. And so I did my first kind of conversational one, and it was either the first, second, or third one I did of that format. All of a sudden I could tell, like, whoa, this is actually resonating with people. And this is a way better way for me to share my ideas and kind of the complexity or nuance that I wanted to get out of it. Uh, and then, what they told me is like, when you find something that works, just don't quit. And I just kept, basically what I do is I'm always listening and reading stuff, and I just take what the smart guys are saying. And I feel like that's my gift, is I just make it simpler so that people that, won't ever listen to the 3 hour Carey Nieuwhof and Tim Keller podcast because it's like 3.5 hours, but it's got so much gold in it. I take the few pieces that I'm like, this is so fascinating. Like, let me, and it would be so valuable if people would get it. And so I just kind of extract that, try to get it down to, 90 seconds. And so I just pump that stuff out. And I've been so surprised at how positively it's resonated with people, how encouraged people are. I mean, I get some haters. I do some stuff on kind of like contextualizing the gospel, that some of like the hardline people come out and I think they're just afraid that I'm messing like with the foundation of the gospel,
Hmm.
which I'm not trying to do. And so I'll get pushback from them. Atheists will come out and, they'll kind of, have arguments in the comment section. But and honestly, some of that is actually really fun to try to engage with them, because you test yourself. You're like, how well do I know these ideas, and do I have something to say to this? So that's actually been kind of enjoyable when it's in good faith. Sometimes people are just angry, or it seems that they're angry. But I have won over so many people with like just kind of a kind, thoughtful response. People will come back and be like, "Hey, you know what? I'm so sorry that I said that. I was totally off base, actually." And that's kind of been kind of a fun challenge, is how many people can I win over. But yeah, I think, when I look at my page, I want people to think, am I being pushed to do something with my faith, to take action? Am I learning how to share the gospel with a new generation? Because that's, I think, a very interesting idea, is as these younger guys grow up, not in church, not knowing the biblical stories, I think some of the way that traditionally Western Christianity has preached the gospel to them, it's not going to connect with their heart, because they don't have a grid for being guilty before God the judge. That's not a paradigm that they're wrestling with. But I think the fear power paradigm of the gospel, that Jesus is victorious over broken creation. And so, what does Gen Z do with all their anxiety that they're experiencing? They believe in the spiritual realm. They believe in angels and demons, not like millennials didn't really. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see if how we preach the gospel and how we win them over and show them the beauty of Jesus, if that, at least the start of that conversation is going to look different than it did, you know, in the last season or generations.
I'd love to hear you talk about the identity piece too of the gospel and the power of placing your identity in Jesus, finding a place to put your identity in a generation that has a lot of questions about who they are and what their identity is. My other point, just briefly, is about coming at it with that attitude of grace and being apologetic in the way that you are, but also not claiming to have all the answers. I've seen go a long way for
Yeah.
people closer to our age, is not claiming to know everything and saying, here's the problem of evil. Why do bad things happen to good people? And the Bible gives us answers, it gives us conversation partners,
Yeah.
but there's still an element of wrestling with a God who's bigger than us and whose ways we can't fully understand.
Yeah.
And I've seen that being helpful, opening the door to saying, I have some ideas about why bad things happen to good people that allow me to sleep. but I won't fully understand it in this lifetime
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
my brain's not big enough. Because the person who created the universe has a much broader understanding of good and evil than me. We're
Yeah.
different beings. We're made of different material, and
Yeah.
that's okay. And owning that instead of
Yeah.
claiming to have a comprehensive prescriptive answer, I think is going to be a really fruitful approach
Yes.
moving forward, is opening up that dialogue and being vulnerable enough to say, I'm okay to live in some unknown. We're not in a sea of unknown, and that scripture gives us
Yeah.
enough. Um, so I want to hear you, if you have any thoughts on that and
Oh,
about the
yeah.
identity
I mean,
question.
it's so interesting that you bring that up. I just finished listening to a podcast. Somebody recommended it. I hadn't heard of it before, but it was fascinating. It was Theology in the Raw, and they had
Hmm.
some literature, high school literature teacher on, because I just finished reading the Brothers Karamazov,
Russian
and
literature,
and I
Dostoevsky.
and I was like, I need somebody's help, like somebody smart to like unpack this. Like I made it through, but somebody tell me like
Yeah,
all
900
the things
pages
that I
is not
missed.
easy. Yep.
And he was talking about how, in the 90s the apologists kind of said, hey, we have all the answers, there's not anything you can hit us with that we can't convince you of. And he's like, you know he just felt like it was a little bit dishonest in saying there are some things that we really, as a worldview, and have a hard time answering for, some really hard things of, like he describes in the book, the children suffering. And I there's something, I feel like Gen Z, they really love that authenticity and the rawness. And uh I agree with you. I don't think they want some of those dogmatic approaches. They understand the complexity and how there's things of value in other worldviews. And but ultimately, if we can show them that out of all the, maybe, people not seeing fully, that there is something uh, elevated about the Christian worldview and something true that really does heal and restore. So I 100% like that, open dialogue approach. That's usually how, I get into conversations with people. Um, but I guess I've also found it's really good to stay provoked by people. Like I got a buddy Frenchie who, he just goes up to people and says like, "Hey, are you born again?" And he sees the craziest transformations. Like his stories of people, getting healed, getting delivered, being, on the verge of suicide, and then Frenchie comes up, says something crazy to him, and then, their life totally changed, like turns upside down. So, I think there's a place for both of those. And I know I need to keep being provoked by the bold guys, because my tendency is, to be a little bit more conversational, like, hey, if you don't want this, that's fine. Where he's like, no, you need this, like this will change your life. And it's true. um so yeah, I think but I think I agree with your approach that that's a good way to engage people, because I think that's what they're used to. They've seen so many ideas, they've heard so many discussions, um, that it needs to be a little bit more conversational with them.
And honest. You brought it up earlier.
Yeah,
Just being sincere is, I mean, that's what we're called to do, along with all the other things, is just to be honest and to not pretend to have something that you don't have, because what we have is enough, and
yeah,
what you have in the Holy Spirit is enough. And
yeah,
we don't have to pretend that it's something that it's not. And again, it's not to disparage the apologists. I understand where they're coming from, and like they've put together a mighty piece of work that is valuable and is
yeah,
helpful. I think it's just a spirit maybe for a different generation, and is responding to something real. And that doesn't mean that it's not valuable and it's not still there, and that there's not a group that would still find that the most valuable thing. I think
yeah,
that's also the benefit of having 2,000 years of church and so much material, that there is, I mean, there's going to be a movement or a line of thinking that
yeah.
clicks, hopefully for everyone who can find it.
I wonder if because politics is so divided. and there's so much like I'm right, and just you can see how unhealthy the conversations are. And I wonder if that is, obviously so off-putting, that I wonder if people see that in the religious sphere and they're just like, I can't, like, I don't want that here. I don't want any sort of Christianity that kind of creates that um, dichotomy. Uh, and and so, yeah, I wonder if that is what part of the reason why people want a dialogue, because they just see so much division and polarization, and they realize, oh, life is not that black and white. So why don't we have a discussion about it? I wonder if that is involved in how, what has shaped their approach to the big questions of life.
I think so. I think that's definitely possible. And again, there's so many different swaths of, at least in America,
Yeah,
there's so many people, and it
so
depends on what
true.
state you live in, right? I mean,
Yeah,
that's why, I mean, you need to be in relationship with people, with
yeah,
Christians who are going to push you, and with non Christians who are going to remind you where we're at. I think that's the point. Which again, you don't need me to tell you that. Yeah, the state of politics is so different in every neighborhood that
yeah.
the way you
It's
approach
true.
that conversation depends on who you're sitting with and yeah, what color your state is.
Yeah,
I wonder if we've talked a lot about hearing God, and I've loved it. I found it very fruitful and encouraging and challenging. I think even me sitting here listening to you talk about your bold friends, it makes me uncomfortable. It makes me
yeah,
feel convicted and think, oh, I don't want to do that. I sincerely, but I love the Lord. If that's what He's calling me to do, I want to be willing to do that. And I know that's how so many people feel, and will feel
yeah,
listening to you explain it with such confidence to say, like, "Oh, is that me? Am I? Are we the same religion?" And I think that it's good. That's that kind of healthy Holy Spirit nudging that we need all the time. Do you have any more practical tips? What do you tell people? Um, if you give any more advice for a regular person who maybe goes to a regular American church
yeah,
and it has no problem with it. I don't think it's as broken an institution as many people think it is. It's doing a lot of good for a lot of people.
yeah,
How can we get one step better at sharing the gospel at school, at work?
yeah. I've been thinking a lot about this, actually. Um, I'm going to start filming an online course actually tomorrow, because I've seen so many people struggling with this. Um, and I think, I mean, some of the real practicals are, I really think finding a buddy is a huge deal. Finding that friend that's like, hey, can we just go out, you know, once a week for the next 3 months? I'm a big believer in doing things in seasons, because I think if you think, gosh, I have to share the gospel every week for a year, I think most people can't do that. I think they're going to quit. But usually, if you can do something for a couple months, you kind of put a stake in the ground, and you change how you approach it. You change your fear on that thing, and you just learn so much. So what I would probably say is find one friend that is really interested in growing and hearing God's voice and sharing the gospel, and just, make a challenge for yourself and say, hey, together, can we go together, or can we just check in? And I want to have this many conversations a week with people or something. You just make yourself a little challenge. uh and then, I guess, a really a really easy paradigm is just think, how is Jesus good news for this person?
Hmm.
And the only way to figure that out is by real conversation and actually like listening to them. And is it their struggle with anxiety? Is it they just lost a parent? Have they violated their conscience? Do they have no meaning for their life, and they don't understand where to get meaning and purpose? uh, and I think if you begin to think about Jesus in those terms, I think the gospel becomes bigger than, let me just tell you, God created the world, we sinned, Jesus had to come to save us. uh, and it becomes, how is Jesus going to meet this person and show them that he wants to restore their life. And then that's like a little picture or a little bud that kind of grows and blooms, and all of a sudden they're like, whoa, I was curious about Jesus because I had anxiety, and you told me he really helped you with that. But now all of a sudden I'm seeing he's helping me restore my relationship with my mom. And holy cow, like I didn't realize I had this separation from God, and Jesus is reuniting me. um and you can be there, to walk them through all those processes. um but okay, so that I guess is more relational, because that takes time to unfold. um but if you wanted to just get out and share with strangers on the street, a couple principles would be probably, look for somebody with real spiritual hunger. You go up to a lot of people and they don't. I was at a state fair a couple weeks ago, and I went up to two guys. I used Frenchie as inspiration, and I kind of twisted it. I said, hey, have you guys ever heard the phrase like to be born again? Have you ever heard a Christian say that? Like, do you know what that means? Are you curious about that? And one guy standing there was like, no, no, no. And you could just tell, not having it, didn't want to talk. But his buddy next to him, he was like, oh, yeah, like, tell me about that. I've heard that. And I think that's a real clear picture. Like, don't try to spend time, convincing that guy that doesn't want to talk, spend time where there's real curiosity and hunger. Um, because, I mean, there's something to be said about trying to till the soil and make somebody ready. Um, but you want to kind of work where the ground is fertile. And um and so find somebody with real spiritual hunger, somebody that's open to talking to you. And then I think probably one of the most effective tools is to share your own testimony. And you think about it this way: hey, can I just tell you, before my life, this is what it was like. This is how I met Jesus and what he revealed himself like as a solution to that. And now uh this is my life after. So it's kind of a before, here's how I met Jesus, and after. And I mean, the reason that works so well in our culture is, how do you argue with experience? And you just want to put the beauty and the beauty of Jesus and the power of Jesus on display for people, so that they kind of lean in and say, "Oh wow, like I want to know more about this this Savior, basically, that you have."
That makes me think of being back in the academy now. The way to most correctly write truth to generate knowledge now is to acknowledge your situatedness, where you're coming from, your background, and then to share what you have to share and acknowledge that it's your limited perspective. But that's the new mode for generating knowledge in the academy. And I think that's reflected in what you're saying and how to share with someone is say where you're coming from. I think that's connected with also not claiming to have every single answer to every single question, is this attitude of here's where I'm coming from. That's all that what I can offer you is what I know. And the Jesus that I know and have experienced is what I hear you saying. And it really resonates with me, thinking that's just the world we live in now. You can't write academically. I mean, you can't get published if you're not willing to acknowledge where you're coming from, your blind spots,
Hmm.
what you're trying to do. And if you have different assumptions, you need to air out the assumptions and then go on with your work, with your research. But acknowledging that you have these unique assumptions. And to me, that's very similar to how you've seen it fruitful to share the gospel, is
Yeah.
to just own up to it and to say, here's who I am, here's what I know,
Yeah.
and to go from there. So that really resonates with what
Yeah.
I've seen, at least at school.
I I think there was a pressure I used to feel too, that every person that I talked to, I would have to kind of give them all the information.
Hmm.
And it just leads to awkward conversations, because you're not actually connecting with a person. You're trying to deliver like a set of data to them. Like,
Right.
here, believe all these things, and do you agree? And you just realize, like, those words for the most part don't mean anything to them. Like, they have to figure out that one piece and how it fits in their context and their worldview. And so that really helped me when I just kind of chilled out and said, okay, I might just get them a little bit closer, one step closer. But if they walk away and kind of think as their head hits the pillow, wow, I've never thought about Jesus like that. Or, the next time they feel anxious, it's like, I wonder if I should try crying out to God for, him to be my peace or something like that. Um, that is success. And it's not just if, you know, deliver all the information and get to, pray a salvation prayer with them.
Right. Yeah, you just never know. I feel like as we close, and this conversation's been really fun. I've really enjoyed it. The story of the rich young ruler keeps coming to mind for me in
Hmm.
this conversation of someone who Jesus doesn't tell the whole story to. It's really a brief
Yeah.
conversation, and he goes away. He goes away bummed. But I have this. I've always felt this funny connection and hope that he did eventually come to faith, and that moment of despair was a step along his journey of hopefully
Yeah.
coming to accept Jesus. And that story is just kind of it's come to mind several times as
Huh.
you've been talking, and I've thought you just never know. If you don't act on that hunch, nothing will happen. But if you do, even if it feels like a miss, like you kept saying, you just never know.
Yeah.
And
True.
what a better place would be in if everyone who proclaimed Jesus was willing to do it more often, myself included, and to risk the miss. Because
Yeah.
even the miss, you'd never know if it's actually a miss. And I think that will be the fun of, in the end, when you get to see all the things that God's been doing in everyone that you didn't even know about. Um, as we close, could you give us a couple book recommendations? And you're not allowed to say the Brothers K. I'm reading Crime and Punishment right now,
Oh yeah.
so I have enough. I have enough Dostoevsky in my head. So no Russian literature. Give us a couple book recommendations.
um. Okay. This is a really short book, but I think the paradigm was really interesting, and I touched on it. It's called the 3D Gospel, and I think it's a missionary favorite book, and it talks about different cultures and how they resonate with the full picture of the gospel. It looks at the guilt, innocence cultures, the shame and honor ones, and the fear and power ones. So I think if you kind of want to grow in your knowledge of how big is the gospel, and have some ideas about maybe how the next generation is going to connect with it, I would look at that. Um, okay, the you probably have a lot of um, pretty dynamic young future leaders. There was this book called Spiritual Leadership by Henry Blackaby that just was unbelievable, and it goes through Christian leaders' history, and it's a great spiritual leadership book, and kind of covers your whole life, from how do you manage your time to integrity to how do you move people along to God's vision. I found that one really fascinating. Um, and then, have you ever heard of the book Intercessor by Rees Howells?
No.
Fascinating guy in England, and he's got one. I mean, talk about a guy that heard God and obeyed and had incredible stories. God told him to get on a train and didn't have the money, and so he just in faith like went up, stood in line. He was about to like go up to the cashier window, and he's like, "What am I gonna do? Like, I don't have any money. This is so embarrassing." And the guy turns around in front of him and is like, here's a ticket to get on the train. And so he basically, it's the power of intercession and how he raised up these people that prayed in England. And I think it even had, they were praying for, was it Dunkirk, where the fog fell and the boats could escape or something. um But they're tied up in that history, which was absolutely fascinating. Uh, and then I just read Hudson Taylor's Spiritual Secrets, and another guy, that went to China, um, and it just, his life of sacrifice, of saying yes to the call that God had on him, and the impact that he had, and basically learning how to live a very difficult life fueled by the love of God. Um, it's got some, you know, these missionary biographies. You read them and you're like, "Am I even a Christian?" Like, it's so provoking. So those are some of my favorite books to read because they just open your mind to be like, "Man, I didn't even know that was possible."
That's perfect. That's exactly why I'm so glad you came on the pod. Those are four great recommendations that we're not going to get from the academy. So I'm really grateful for those, for your time. This conversation was pretty great. So
Oh, it was
thanks so
so
much. I
fun.
really enjoyed it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.